If you look at an X-ray of a broken arm, the problem is just, well, it's obvious, right?
Right, yeah.
There's that jagged white line right on the film. The doctor points to the screen, they diagnose the fracture, and they set the bone. It's very binary.
It's legible.
Exactly. It's legible. And honestly, it's incredibly comforting because the causality is entirely visible. But when you step into the world of global history, specifically, the historical and economic realities of the African diaspora, the X-ray machine we're usually handed is just entirely muddy.
Oh, absolutely. The images are completely blurred.
Yeah, and mainstream narratives look at the current realities of, say, Port-au-Prince, or the vast mineral-rich expanse of the Congo, or even the south side of Chicago. And they point to these blurry spots on the film, diagnose a symptom like poverty or political instability or under-resourced schools, and they call that symptom the disease.
Which naturally leads to localized, often highly ineffective treatments, because if you misdiagnose the underlying architecture of a problem, you're essentially just putting a localized bandage on a systemic hemorrhage.
Well said. And that brings us to the absolutely monumental stack of source material sitting on the table between us today. For you listening, the dedicated student of diaspora history, we are basically bypassing those blurry X-rays today.
We are looking at a diagnostic framework that fundamentally, completely reframes how we view geography, economics, and honestly, time itself.
Right. Anchoring our deep dive today is this newly released, incredibly dense comparative analysis. It's dated June 22, 2026 by Jimma, Maat, Dogon, McWilson from the African World Exploratory University. And, McWilson doesn't write in a vacuum here.
Not at all. This analysis is basically the capstone on a formidable foundation of texts. We're talking about works by Walter Rodney, Manning Marable, Kwame Nkrumah, Chika Antida,
Ngige wa Thiong'o, Chinwe Amos N. Wilson, Theodore Cross, and Calvin Schermerhorn.
Yeah, it is a heavy, intellectually demanding reading list. I mean, these are texts that deal in the raw, unapologetic mechanics of political economy and historical sociology.
They really do. But before we dig into those mechanics, let me just clarify our analytical lens for this deep dive. Because these texts present a highly specific, politically charged indictment of global capitalism and historical imperialism.
Right, they're making very bold claims.
Exactly. So our job here is not to debate whether this framework represents the ultimate universal truth, right? Nor are we taking a political stance or, endorsing the viewpoints of these authors. Our mission is strictly analytical.
We're mapping the architecture of their argument. We are exploring their logic and examining the evidence they present so that you, the listener, can understand exactly how this specific academic perspective connects these incredibly disparate histories.
Perfect. So, okay, let's unpack this. The core thesis they are presenting is that the socioeconomic conditions in Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Black urban centers in the United States are absolutely not coincidences.
No, the authors argue they are absolutely not isolated failures. They are connected, active fronts of a long-term, highly organized global system of racial capitalism, a system rooted directly in the mechanisms of slavery and colonialism.
Right. And to connect those dots, the text relies on a conceptual framework that serves as, like, the engine for this entire argument. And that concept is organized abandonment and organized extraction.
That's the key phrase.
I want to push on that immediately, actually, because mainstream geopolitics usually labels a struggling neighborhood in Detroit or a conflict zone in the DRC as a failed state or a failing city. The premise is always that the system broke down.
But McWilson's synthesis argues the exact inverse of that. The system hasn't broken down. It is functioning with ruthless, terrifying efficiency.
Wow. So they aren't failing at all.
According to this framework, no. These zones are deliberately abandoned in terms of social investment, meaning the intentional withdrawal of capital for things like schools, healthcare infrastructure, and basic human rights. But simultaneously, they are highly, intricately organized for the extraction of value.
And by value, they mean raw labor, mineral wealth, debt servicing, and land equity. It completely shifts the blame from the localized population to the systemic architecture built around them.
Exactly. But the sources insist that to really grasp how this architecture functions today, we cannot simply start the clock at, say, the transatlantic slave trade.
Right. We have to rewind much further. We have to understand the ideological software that made the physical hardware of extraction possible in the first place.
We have to look at the erasure of civilizational lineage, because before you can physically extract labor and resources from a specific population for centuries, you require a globally accepted ideology that justifies that extraction.
You need a narrative.
Right. You need a narrative that categorizes the subjugated population as inherently primitive, as existing outside the bounds of human progress.
Which brings us directly to Cheek and to Diops, the African origin of civilization. The text pulls heavily from Diop to argue that the marginalization of black African populations required this deliberate historical erasure of ancient civilizations.
Specifically Kemet, which we commonly call Egypt, as well as Kush and Nubia.
The sources detail how ancient Mediterranean and global powers originally traveled to these African centers to study, right? They went there for science, complex architecture, advanced governance, and philosophy.
They did. But the ideological pivot occurs later. As global powers began to invade and subjugate the continent, there was this concerted, systematic effort to rewrite that history.
To deny that black African origin peoples were the architects of those civilizational contributions.
Exactly. Those achievements were either minimized, completely erased from the historical record, or literally reassigned to non-black populations.
Okay, let me play a devil's advocate here for a second, because a listener might ask, what does the racial classification of an ancient pharaoh in, like, 3000 BCE have to do with a 19th century sugar plantation or a modern cobalt mine?
It's a fair question.
It just seems like an academic debate that's entirely disconnected from modern economics.
Well, the sources argue it is entirely connected, specifically through the mechanism of cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance? How so?
Think about it. If you are a European colonial power preparing to commodify millions of human beings, turn them into chattel property, or subject them to the grotesque horrors of King Leopold's Congo Free State, you require absolute moral and intellectual justification.
Right, you have to sleep at night.
Exactly. You cannot justify enslaving the direct descendants of the people who built the pyramids, mapped the stars, and established foundational mathematics. Acknowledging their civilizational excellence destroys the entire myth of the civilizing mission.
Oh, wow, so you have to categorize them as a lower caste lacking history.
You have to. Erasing Kemet wasn't just bad historiography, it was a psychological weapon.
The paper actually uses a specific phrase for this, preventing collective self-knowledge. And that links directly to Jige Wethiongo's Decolonizing the Mind and Chinvezu's Decolonizing the African Mind, which are, very prominent in our source stack.
Yes, and they argue that this psychological erasure was the absolute prerequisite for the physical exploitation. Jige Wethiongo details the mechanics of linguistic imperialism.
Right, forcing a subjugated population to abandon their native languages.
Exactly. When a colonial power forces a subjugated population to adopt the language of the colonizer, French in Haiti, English in the U.S., French in the DRC, they are executing a structural severing.
Because language isn't just vocabulary.
No, language is the carrier of a people's philosophical framework. It's their historical memory and their definition of reality. If your history is taught to you strictly in the language of the person exploiting you, and that curriculum dictates that your history began with your subjugation,
you are being robbed of your civilizational inheritance.
Exactly. And Chinwezu pushes this even further, arguing that you have to colonize the mind before you can securely colonize the land.
Because if a population possesses that collective self-knowledge, if they are deeply aware that they come from a lineage of builders and scientists and sovereign rulers, they are infinitely harder to subjugate.
They will constantly rebel because they view their current exploited condition as an unnatural aberration rather than their innate destiny.
So the ideological software justifies the physical hardware.
Precisely. Once this narrative of racial hierarchy and historical erasure was firmly installed and globally accepted by the imperial powers, they possessed the moral blank check they needed.
The blank check to construct the physical systems of extraction. Well, let's transition to those physical systems then. Because once the ideology is set, the extraction becomes terrifyingly mechanical.
It really does. McWilson's paper traces 3 distinct but parallel timelines of physical extraction: Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and U.S. black urban centers.
I find it helpful to think of these not as separate historical events, but as different thermodynamic engines.
That's a great analogy.
They run on different fuels depending on the era, but the mechanical output, meaning wealth, flowing directly from the marginalized zone to the European or American metropolitan center, is identical.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. Let's look at the first engine in the sources, Haiti, specifically the era of Saint-Domingue from 1492 to 1804.
Right, under French colonial rule.
Yes. This territory was engineered to be the absolute prototype plantation economy. It was arguably the single wealthiest colony in the world at its peak.
But the text forces us to look at how that wealth was generated. It wasn't just, passive trading. It was an incredibly brutal, accelerated extraction of both human life and ecological resources.
The wealth flowed to Paris and Bordeaux through the mass production of sugar and coffee, and this was fueled by a coerced labor force of enslaved Africans.
And the mechanics of that sugar production were so physically devastating, right? The conditions were so horrific that the life expectancy of an enslaved person upon arriving in Saint-Domingue was measured in mere years.
Just a few years, France simply imported more human beings to replace the ones they systematically worked to death. It was extraction in its purest, most violently efficient form.
Now let's compare that thermodynamic engine to the Democratic Republic of Congo, because the intensive timeline detailed in the sources starts much later there.
Right. It starts in the late 19th century, peaking under King Leopold II's Congo Free State up to 1908, and then evolving under the formal Belgian state.
And crucially, Leopold's Congo wasn't even a traditional colony at first, was it? It was his private corporate fiefdom.
It was his personal property. And the extraction here wasn't agricultural cash crops like sugar, it was wild rubber and ivory.
The logistics of that extraction are just vital to understand. Because to extract wild rubber from vines in the dense rainforest, the colonial authorities utilized unspeakable terror.
They instituted a strict quota system. If a village did not produce enough rubber, the force publique, which was Leopold's mercenary army, would routinely hold women and children hostage.
And they would burn villages.
They would burn villages and they would sever the hands of the Congolese workers. The severed hands were literally used as a currency to prove to officers that the soldiers hadn't wasted their bullets. Millions perished.
It's just horrific. And as the source material stresses, throughout this entire period, there was zero local investment.
None. The infrastructure they did build, the railways and the ports, were essentially giant conveyor belts. They were designed with one single purpose: to transport rubber and later copper and uranium out of the interior and onto ships bound for Antwerp.
Okay, then we shift to the United States. The foundational timeline here is 1619 to 1865. The text roots the early economic condition of Black America in chattel slavery, organizing black labor to produce cash crops.
Initially tobacco, and then overwhelmingly cotton. And we really must look at the financial mechanics of that cotton.
Because it wasn't just about selling a bale of fiber.
Not at all. Enslaved human beings were the premier financial asset of the American economy. Their bodies were mortgaged to secure loans that built Southern infrastructure.
And those mortgages were packaged into bonds, right?
Yeah.
Sold to investors on Wall Street and in London.
Exactly. The agricultural extraction in the South was the foundational bedrock of American national, industrial, and financial wealth.
So we're looking at three distinct engines. Haiti was a steam engine burning human lives and sugar for fuel. The Congo was an internal combustion engine burning wild rubber and minerals. And the U.S. was an engine burning cotton and mortgaged bodies.
The commodities are different and the eras overlap but have different peaks. Yet the underlying source code of racial capitalism is identical in all three.
Human beings and the land they inhabit are basically reduced to disposable inputs in a mathematical equation. An equation designed solely to maximize profit for an external center.
Which brings us to the critical historical pivot in the sources.
Right, because if the foundation of global wealth was physical extraction through formal legal systems of slavery and colonialism, what happens when those specific legal frameworks are abolished?
Exactly. What happens when Haiti fights and wins its independence in 1804? When chattel slavery legally ends in the U.S. in 1865? When the Congo finally achieves independence in 1960?
Does the extraction just stop? I mean, the global matrix doesn't just pack up, apologize, and leave.
No, it certainly doesn't. If you can no longer legally own the body or formally claim the territory as a colony, how do you continue to extract the wealth?
You transition from owning the person to controlling the space.
That's it entirely. The texts argue that the extraction didn't end. It simply remapped itself geographically and institutionally. The geography of the plantation morphed into modern spatial control.
Okay, let's trace this spatial remapping, starting with Haiti. After the revolution, many formerly enslaved people attempted to build a localized subsistence agricultural economy, right?
Yes. They wanted to own small plots of land, grow their own food, and decouple from the global export market that had previously worked them to death.
Makes total sense. But the texts show how the global financial system simply would not allow that autonomy.
The mechanism used to break that autonomy was trade liberalization. The paper highlights a very specific, devastating example of this. The United States dumping subsidized rice into the Haitian market in the late 20th century.
Let's explain the mechanics of how that actually works, because trade liberalization sounds so neutral. It sounds like a good thing.
It does sound neutral, but the reality is anything but. In the U.S., the government heavily subsidizes its agricultural sector through the Farm Bill.
Which means American industrial farmers can produce rice at a cost artificially lower than the actual cost of production.
Right. Meanwhile, international financial institutions pressured Haiti to lower its import tariffs. So suddenly, massive shipments of cheap, subsidized American rice flooded the markets in Port-au-Prince.
So if you are a Haitian rice farmer in the Artibonite Valley, utilizing traditional farming methods without massive government subsidies, you mathematically cannot compete with that artificially cheap imported rice.
You can't. Your crop becomes completely worthless, you lose your livelihood, and eventually you lose your land.
And where do you go? You have no choice but to migrate to the capital.
Exactly. You are driven out of the rural economy and forced into under-resourced, densely packed, hyper-precarious urban slums like Cité Soleil.
And once there, you become part of a massive, desperate urban labor pool. A pool perfectly positioned to be exploited by foreign-owned garment sweatshops paying pennies an hour.
The spatial control shifted from the rural plantation to the urban slum, but the extraction of cheap labor remained perfectly intact.
Wow. Now, let's look at how spatial control evolved in the United States. The text brings in Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America and Calvin Schermerhorn's The Plunder of Black America.
We have to look at the Great Migration, roughly 1890 to 1970, where millions of Black Americans fled the racial terror of the Jim Crow South, moving to northern and western cities seeking industrial jobs.
But they didn't just step into a free and open housing market.
No, they hit a wall of highly organized institutional spatial control. This is where Marable and Schermerhorn argue forcefully that the concept of the ghetto is not a natural occurrence.
Right. It isn't a reflection of cultural failure or just some accident of the free market.
It was a deliberately designed institution drawn up through public policy and private real estate practices.
And the prime mechanism here was redlining, right? By the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, which was a federal agency created in the 1930s.
Yes. Government appraisers and local real estate agents literally drew red lines on city maps around Black neighborhoods. They officially declared them hazardous for mortgage lending.
Which meant banks, backed by the federal government, would simply not provide traditional wealth-building mortgages to anyone living inside those red lines.
Regardless of their individual creditworthiness.
And this was enforced heavily by restrictive covenants, too. Clauses written directly into property deeds that legally prohibited a home from being sold or rented to a Black person in a white neighborhood.
So you have a population trapped geographically, and because they were locked out of the traditional mortgage market, they were subjected to predatory extraction.
Right. Landlords could charge exorbitant rents for subdivided, substandard housing because the tenants literally had nowhere else to go.
Furthermore, those who tried to buy homes were forced into contract buying.
Oh, contract buying is an incredibly vicious mechanism.
It really is. Unlike a standard mortgage where you build equity with every payment and the title is in your name in a contract sale, the seller keeps the deed until the very last payment is made.
So you have all the responsibilities of a homeowner, repairs, taxes, but absolutely none of the legal protections.
Exactly. If you miss a single payment after 15 years, you are evicted and you lose all the equity you've put in. The seller then turns around and does it to the next family.
And then in the mid-20th century, when the federal government decided to build the interstate highway system, they deliberately routed those highways directly through thriving Black business districts.
Bulldozing the economic centers and further isolating these communities. By trapping Black populations in these zones, the wealth they generated through their industrial wages was continuously extracted by outside landlords, predatory lenders, and eventually gentrifying developers.
It is organized abandonment of city services, coupled with the highly organized extraction of income. So what about the DRC? How does spatial legacy operate in a nation the size of Western Europe?
Well, in the Congo, the colonial mapping strategy was dictated entirely by geology.
Because of the minerals.
Right. The Belgians, and later the neo-colonial corporate structures, created highly secure, heavily militarized zones precisely around the strategic assets. The copper mines in Katanga, the diamond fields, the infrastructure corridors leading to the ports.
And these specific zones are maintained with modern infrastructure to ensure the uninterrupted flow of resources out of the country.
Yes, but the rest of the country, the vast interior and massive urban centers like Kinshasa, are subjected to that organized abandonment. The state does not provide paved roads, robust healthcare, or functional public schools.
And this spatial divide creates a permanent state of localized precarity. If you have no rural agricultural support and no urban social safety net, you are forced into desperate survival strategies.
Which guarantees the mining conglomerates a constant, expendable labor force willing to descend into artisanal cobalt mines for essentially starvation wages.
The spatial map of the Congo is literally drawn to prioritize the extraction of its geology over the survival of its sociology. It's wild, but, drawing these red lines on a map or declaring an agricultural zone abandoned is really just geometry.
Sure.
People don't naturally stay in under-resourced, dangerous zones while wealth accumulates right down the street. Human instinct is to migrate towards safety and opportunity. So how did the architects of this system actually keep people contained without utilizing outright legal slavery?
This naturally leads us to the mechanisms of coercion. You cannot maintain an artificial, highly unequal spatial geography without the continuous application of state violence.
The sources trace an unbroken lineage from the overt violence of the plantation overseer to the institutionalized violence of modern state forces, right?
They do. Let's follow that lineage in the United States first. The text draws a direct structural line from the slave patrols of the antebellum South to modern policing and the carceral state.
Historically, slave patrols were the first formalized, state-sponsored policing entities in the American South.
And their explicit legal mandate was not to solve crimes or protect the general public. Their mandate was to control the physical movement of enslaved black people.
To capture those attempting to escape and suppress any whispers of rebellion, they existed strictly to protect the economic assets of the plantation class.
And the authors argue this institutional DNA carried forward into the post-abolition era. When slavery ended, those patrols evolved into police departments tasked with enforcing Jim Crow segregation, vagrancy laws, and the Black Codes.
Laws that were specifically designed to criminalize everyday black life.
Exactly, allowing the state to arrest black Americans en masse and literally lease their labor back to plantations, railroads, and coal mines through the convict lease system.
Fast forward to the modern era, and the text points to the war on drugs, aggressive zero-tolerance urban policing, the militarization of local police forces, and the sprawling mass incarceration system.
And this carceral apparatus is overwhelmingly concentrated in the exact same historically red-line neighborhoods we just discussed. The carceral state effectively becomes the new mechanism of spatial and economic control.
Wait, let me challenge that for a second. Because redlining ended legally with the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Segregation is illegal.
Right.
So if the formal barriers were removed over 50 years ago, how can the author claim the ghetto or the prison system is an actively functioning mechanism of economic extraction today, rather than just like a lingering historical hangover?
Because the extraction mechanism simply evolved into predatory inclusion and surplus population management.
Surplus population management.
Yes. When the industrial jobs fled these urban centers in the 1970s and 80s, the black labor force that was originally pulled there during the Great Migration was no longer needed by industrial capital.
So they became what sociologists call a surplus population.
Exactly. And the carceral state stepped in to manage that surplus. The extraction shifted from factory labor to the extraction of court fees, predatory bail bonds, commissary price gouging, and the privatization of prison services.
Wow. So the system extracts revenue from the marginalized population through the justice system itself, while simultaneously removing them from the civic and economic life of the city.
That's exactly how the text frames it.
Okay, now let's look at Haiti. How do you coerce an entire independent republic that successfully freed itself?
You use overwhelming international military force. The plantation violence transitioned into punitive foreign military interventions and occupations. Whenever Haitian politics threatened the interests of Western capital, the coercion arrived by sea.
And the text explicitly highlights the United States military occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934.
It does. And why did the U.S. Marines land in Haiti in 1915? It wasn't a humanitarian mission.
Not at all. They literally walked into the Haitian National Bank, took the country's gold reserves, and shipped them to Wall Street to be held by the institution that would become Citibank.
They took control of Haitian customs houses, ensuring that debt payments to Western banks were prioritized over domestic spending.
And to facilitate their control of the interior, the U.S. occupation forces reinstituted a system called the corvée. Let's explain the corvée.
It is essentially state-sponsored forced labor.
Right. U.S. Marines forced Haitian peasants, often at gunpoint, to build roads and infrastructure. But these roads weren't built to connect communities or benefit the local economy.
No, they were built to facilitate the rapid movement of agricultural exports to the ports and to allow the U.S. military to quickly move troops around the country to violently suppress the Caicos, which was the Haitian peasant resistance.
It was the literal reintroduction of plantation-style forced labor by a foreign occupying army designed to discipline Haitian sovereignty and protect American banking interests.
And the evolution of coercion in the DRC is equally tragic and complex. Under King Leopold and the subsequent Belgian colonial rule, the primary mechanism of coercion was the force publique, which we discussed earlier.
That brutally violent colonial gendarmerie.
Right. And when the Congo achieved independence, that colonial military structure did not miraculously dissolve into a peaceful, democratic security force.
The sources argue it fractured and morphed.
It morphed into a chaotic web of post-independence national armies, state security forces, heavily armed rebel groups, and proxy militias often funded by neighboring countries.
And what is the function of this continuous simmering warfare? It enforces the continued extraction of minerals through terror, mass displacement, and horrific gender-based violence.
This is where McWilson's synthesis radically flips the script on modern geopolitics. Mainstream news constantly refers to the DRC as a failed state. It's the go-to geopolitical buzzword for chaos.
But the author argues that if you look at the DRC strictly through the lens of extraction, it isn't failing at all.
Exactly. The authors compare the criminal state of the DRC to the organized ghetto in the U.S. Both of these constructs function perfectly to manage populations located near strategic assets.
In the Congo, the strategic assets are the vast reserves of cobalt, coltan, and copper into the ground. In the U.S., the strategic assets were historically cheap industrial labor, and now it's the urban land itself, primed for gentrification.
So the Congolese state completely fails at providing public health, education, and basic human rights to its citizens. But it is a highly efficient state for foreign commercial partners.
The supply chains of cobalt to multinational tech companies rarely stop, even in the midst of massive conflict.
Right. The chaos is actually a coercive tool. It keeps the local population destabilized, preventing them from forming a strong, unified civil society that could demand nationalization of the mines or a fair share of the profits.
The state is highly successful at its unspoken purpose, securing the extraction zones.
And the organized ghetto operates on the exact same logic. It fails at producing generational wealth, high life expectancies, or functional schools for its residents, but it is highly efficient at extracting rent, localized municipal fines, and prison labor while keeping that population geographically contained.
They do not fail. They succeed horribly. It strips away the illusion of incompetence and replaces it with the chilling reality of intention.
It's a heavy realization.
It is. But as the 20th century progressed, the optics of direct military occupations, formal segregation, and overt colonial armies became globally unacceptable.
The architects of the system needed a new tool, a cleaner tool, to maintain the hierarchy without looking like 19th century imperialists.
And they found the perfect invisible weapon in international finance. Which brings us to the financial chains and the transition to modern debt regimes.
This is a crucial historical marker in the texts. This is where the physical shackles of forced labor and the batons of the overseer transition into the digital ledgers, compound interest, and structural adjustments of modern debt cycles.
And there's no more glaring, staggering example of this in our entire stack of sources than Haiti's independence debt.
This specific historical event should be a mandatory case study in every economics class globally. In 1804, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue achieved the impossible.
They militarily defeated the armies of France, Britain, and Spain, abolished slavery, and declared the independent Black Republic of Haiti.
But a global matrix built entirely on the profitability of chattel slavery could not allow a sovereign, free Black Republic to thrive. It was an existential threat to the economic order of the 19th century.
So the global powers isolated Haiti economically, refusing to trade with them. And then, in 1825, France returned.
France sent a fleet of warships bristling with cannons to the harbor of Port-au-Prince. Through literal gunboat diplomacy, they issued an ultimatum.
Face complete naval blockade and a devastating war of re-enslavement, or sign an ordinance agreeing to pay an indemnity of 150 million francs to compensate French planters for their lost property.
Let's pause and absorb the absolute depravity of that demand. You fight a brutal, decades-long revolution. You win your freedom from the most horrific system of torture and extraction imaginable.
And the global community's response is to hand you an invoice for the property you stole, which is yourself, land you bled on, and the bodies of your own children.
It is unfathomable. And because Haiti, a nation recovering from a scorched earth war, obviously did not have 150 million francs in cash sitting in a vault, France forced them to take out loans from French banks.
Banks like the Credit Industriel et Commercial.
Yes, forced to take loans to pay the indemnity.
So wait, let me get the mechanics of this straight. They were forced to borrow money from the banking sector of the country that enslaved them to pay back the literal individuals who previously enslaved them as a penalty for the crime of no longer being enslaved.
That is exactly what happened.
And then those banks charged them interest on the loans. That is not just a diplomatic penalty. That is centuries-long economic warfare.
The mathematics detailed in the text are devastating. That 150 million francs was equivalent to roughly 16 times Haiti's entire annual economic output at the time.
16 times.
To make these payments, the Haitian government was forced to direct up to 80% of its national revenue straight to French bankers for over a century. They did not finish paying off this odious debt until 1947.
Think about the compounding opportunity cost of that. For 122 years, while other nations in the 19th and 20th centuries were utilizing their national revenue to build public school systems, pave roads, establish healthcare infrastructure, and build a robust domestic tax base.
Haiti was packaging its national wealth and shipping it across the Atlantic to Paris. It permanently locked in the underdevelopment we see today.
It wasn't innate political corruption that started the cycle of poverty. It was a century-long, legalized heist enforced by the global financial system.
And we see a parallel mechanism of financial extraction deployed in the DRC. When the Congo finally won its independence from Belgium in 1960, the Belgian colonial government had incurred massive debts.
But what did they spend that borrowed money on? They spent it building the extractive infrastructure.
Right. The railways leading to the copper mines, the ports, and the military apparatus of the force public used to oppress the Congolese.
Infrastructure built solely to drain the Congo's wealth.
Precisely. And upon independence, the international financial community legally transferred those colonial debts onto the ledger of the newly independent Congolese state. The new nation was born instantly drowning in debt that was historically utilized to oppress them.
And the sources argue this wasn't just a historical trick from the 19th or mid-20th century. The mechanism evolved and was refined in the modern era through international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank.
Here we must refer to Kwame Nkrumah's incredibly prescient book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Nkrumah, the first prime minister of an independent Ghana, argued that imperial powers realized they didn't need the expense and bad optics of physically occupying a country with an army.
Not if they could control its economy through the invisible chains of debt. How does that actually work in practice, though?
Well, let's say a developing nation is facing an economic crisis, often a crisis catalyzed by these exact historical odious debts we just talked about. They turn to the IMF or World Bank for a bailout loan.
Right. And what happens next?
The text explains that these loans are never free money. They come with severe binding conditions known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. The creditors essentially dictate the domestic macroeconomic policy of the sovereign nation. First, they demand austerity.
Meaning the government is legally mandated to slash public spending. They have to cut funding for public hospitals, fire teachers, and eliminate subsidies for basic food staples.
Second, they demand the privatization of state-owned assets. The country is forced to sell off its nationalized industries, its telecommunications, its water utilities, its mining rights, often to foreign multinational corporations at bargain basement prices.
And third, they demand export-driven models, forcing the country's agricultural sector to produce cash crops for the global market rather than food to feed its own citizens.
So the debt acts as a form of remote colonial governance. The creditors sitting in boardrooms in Washington, D.C., Paris, or London wield more functional power over the country's national budget and resource allocation than the democratically elected governments in Port-au-Prince or Kinshasa.
And the brilliant synthesis of McWilson's paper is how it draws a direct parallel between this international financial extraction and how predatory finance operates domestically within the United States.
Yes, it identifies a localized domestic version of the exact same debt regime.
Right. The text discusses the evolution of predatory lending and discriminatory credit policies within Black U.S. neighborhoods. We talked earlier about how redlining formally locked Black Americans out of traditional mortgages.
But when the laws changed, the banking sector didn't suddenly offer equitable terms. They shifted from exclusion to predatory inclusion.
Because if you are systemically excluded from traditional wealth-building prime mortgages, you are forced into a shadow banking system. This means subprime mortgages with exploding adjustable interest rates, predatory payday loans, and exorbitant auto loan rates.
These financial instruments are designed to extract maximum interest while building zero wealth. Just as the IMF debt extracts national wealth from Haiti or the DRC, transferring it to Western banks, these predatory domestic policies act as massive financial vacuums.
They continuously drain home equity, wages, and generational wealth out of Black neighborhoods and transfer it upward into the broader white-dominated financial sector.
The chains transitioned from iron on the wrists to restrictive covenants on paper and now to algorithmic credit scores and digital debt ledgers. But the thermodynamic engine remains the same.
The direction of the wealth transfer is entirely unchanged, from the marginalized periphery to the powerful center. It is a profoundly bleak picture of a multimillennial matrix of control. It can feel overwhelming to map out the sheer scale and adaptability of this system.
It is heavy. But, and there's a critical pivot in our deep dive, the source material absolutely does not end there.
Right. The final section of McWilson's analysis, and the core of texts by authors like McWilson and Theodore Cross, focuses on Pan-Africanism and the ideological resistance.
Because despite this incredibly sophisticated, shape-shifting system of extraction, the texts vehemently emphasize that these populations were never simply passive victims acting as cogs in the machine.
Never. The system required constant evolution, precisely because the resistance was constant.
And because the nature of the extraction was part of a shared global matrix, the ideological and political resistance that birthed from it became global as well.
The sources argue that Pan-Africanism provided the vital connective tissue, linking the struggles of Haiti, the DRC, and Black U.S. cities as connected fronts in a unified global struggle against racial capitalism. Let's look at Haiti's role as the foundation of this resistance.
Haiti stands as the ultimate foundational symbol. By becoming the first free Black republic in 1804, Haiti definitively proved that the ultimate system of extraction chattel slavery, backed by the world's most powerful empires, could be utterly defeated by the enslaved themselves.
That reality sent absolute shockwaves through the global matrix. It was a terrifying existential threat to the plantation owners of the American South and the Caribbean. But it served as an incredibly inspiring beacon for enslaved and colonized people everywhere.
The text notes how deeply the Haitian Revolution influenced global Black identity. It provided empirical proof that sovereignty and liberation were materially possible.
Moving to the African continent, in the DRC, we see the resistance manifest in the rise of figures like Patrice Lumumba, the first legally elected prime minister of the independent Congo, in 1960.
And Lumumba was deeply influenced by the Pan-African ideological scaffolding provided by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah.
Nkrumah understood that individual African nations, newly independent but burdened with colonial debt, could not fight off neo-colonial resource predation alone. He advocated for profound continental unity.
A United States of Africa that could leverage its collective strength to control its own resources, dictate its own terms of trade, and freeze out the extractive multinational conglomerates.
Lumumba shared this vision. His insistence on a truly sovereign Congo that controlled its own immense mineral wealth, rather than allowing it to be drained by Belgian and American mining interests, was viewed as entirely unacceptable by the global matrix.
He was so threatening to the architecture of extraction that he was assassinated in 1961 with the direct complicity of Western intelligence agencies. But his martyrdom only further cemented Pan-African resistance and anti-imperialist consciousness across the region.
And how does this global consciousness connect back to the urban centers in the United States? The text brings in McWilson's blueprint for Black Power and Theodore Cross's The Black Power Imperative.
During the civil rights and Black Power movements in the U.S., leaders and grassroots activists did not view their struggle in an isolated domestic vacuum. They were explicitly internationalist.
They closely studied the history of the Haitian Revolution. They read Frantz Fanon.
They closely followed the anti-colonial struggles raging across Africa, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and the tragedy of Lumumba in the Congo. When Lumumba was assassinated, Black activists protested furiously at the United Nations in New York.
So Pan-Africanism provided activists with a crucial analytical lens. It allowed them to understand that their localized struggles were fundamentally interconnected.
Exactly. Whether you are an activist fighting against a discriminatory slumlording property owner in a red line neighborhood in Chicago, a miner protesting a foreign conglomerate draining resources in the Katanga province of the Congo, or a peasant farmer fighting against an IMF austerity mandate in Haiti.
Pan-Africanism provided the intellectual framework to say, we are fighting different tentacles of the exact same octopus. We are all fighting the mechanics of racial capitalism.
I have to say, for a listener studying diaspora history, this is such a profoundly empowering perspective.
It takes a historical narrative that is so often framed by mainstream sociology as isolated victimhood. Look at this poor, broken neighborhood, or look at this tragically unstable country, and shifts it entirely.
It reveals a massive interconnected legacy of brilliant, ongoing global resistance. It shows that the survival, the profound cultural creation, and the ongoing political production of these communities, in the face of a multi-millennial, heavily militarized project of extraction, is an absolute testament to human resilience.
It is the ultimate counter-narrative to the ideology of erasure we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive. By reclaiming the ancient history, identifying the exact systemic nature of the modern exploitation, and linking arms across oceans and geographies, the resistance actively dismantled the psychological chains that Chinwizu and Ngugi Thiong'o warned about.
They achieved collective self-knowledge.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, diving deep into the dense mechanical realities of these historical texts. So let's step back and survey the architecture we've mapped out from Jimma, Maat, Dogon, McWilson's analysis.
We started by uncovering the ideological blueprint, the deliberate psychological erasure of ancient African civilizational excellence in Kemet and Kush, a narrative designed strictly to justify future subjugation.
We then traced how that ideology was made physical in the thermodynamic engines of extraction. The brutal sugar plantations of Haiti, the mortgaged cotton fields of the U.S. South, and the terror-driven rubber vines of King Leopold's Congo.
We examined how those physical systems of extraction didn't disappear with abolition or independence, but adapted and evolved geographically. We mapped how the plantation morphed into the institutional redlining of U.S. cities, the artificially created, under-resourced slums of Port-au-Prince, and the militarized, heavily guarded mining zones of the DRC.
We analyzed the continuous mechanisms of state coercion required to maintain these unequal spaces, from the legal mandate of slave patrols evolving into modern mass incarceration to foreign military interventions and occupations designed to crush sovereignty.
And we tracked the highly sophisticated evolution of extraction itself, transitioning from the physical theft of labor into the digital ledgers of modern international debt, IMF structural adjustments, and predatory domestic lending that strips wealth from the marginalized.
And finally, we saw the interconnected web of ideological resistance, Pan-Africanism linking the foundational victory of the Haitian Revolution to the anti-colonial independence movements of Africa, to the Black Power movement in the United States.
The ultimate conclusion presented by this stack of sources is undeniably clear. The crises we see in these seemingly disparate geographic areas are not coincidences.
They are not the result of cultural flaws, innate deficits, or political incompetence. They are the highly predictable, statistically guaranteed, and meticulously engineered outcomes of a global economic system based entirely on organized abandonment and organized extraction. The muddy X-ray is suddenly sharply in focus.
It clarifies the mechanics of the world we inhabit.
It really does. But before we sign off, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We want to take this historical framework we've just unpacked and apply it directly to the reality you are physically interacting with right this very second.
Think about the smartphone you might be holding to listen to this, or the laptop on your desk. Think about the electric vehicle parked on your street. The green revolution and the digital revolution are being heralded globally as the pinnacle of modern progress, the advanced future of humanity.
But the vital cobalt and coltan powering every single one of those lithium-ion batteries and microchips are primarily extracted right now from the earth of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Extracted under incredibly precarious, often dangerous conditions, assembled by hyper-exploited labor in global sweatshops, and financed by the exact same massive global banking centers that manage the historical debts and structural adjustments we discussed today.
So the question to take away, the question this framework forces us to ask, is this. If the physical raw materials of our supposedly advanced progressive future are still moving strictly along the exact same colonial trade routes established centuries ago, pulled from the marginalized periphery to enrich the powerful center, Are we actually living in a post-colonial world?
Or have the ledgers of extraction simply been digitized for the 21st century?
It brings us right back to the beginning. The geopolitical X-ray machine isn't broken. The system isn't sailing. It is working exactly as it was designed to work. We just haven't always possessed the framework to admit what the bones actually look like.
Thank you for joining us on this intense and illuminating journey through this vital stack of diaspora history.
Keep questioning the mainstream narratives. Keep looking closely at the deep economic structures beneath the surface, and keep asking the big, uncomfortable questions. We'll see you on the next deep dive.